The woman sitting across from detectives doesn't look nervous. She smiles politely. She speaks softly. At times, she even laughs. And that's exactly what makes the situation feel so disturbing. Because by the time Jodi Arias walks into that interrogation room, her ex-boyfriend, Travis Alexander, has already been found dead inside his home in Mesa, Arizona. What investigators are looking at is not a missing persons case. It's a homicide investigation. And almost immediately, something about Jodi Arias begins to feel off. Not because she's emotional, not because she's panicking, but because every time detectives think they're getting closer to the truth, her story changes. First, she says she was nowhere near the house. Then suddenly, 2 masked intruders become responsible. Later, she admits she killed Travis, but claims it was self-defense. 3 completely different stories. And somehow, each one sounds carefully constructed, as though she's adjusting the narrative in real time, trying to stay one step ahead of the evidence. But the deeper investigators dig into the relationship between Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander, the darker everything becomes. Because this wasn't just a breakup gone wrong. Behind closed doors was a relationship filled with emotional obsession, jealousy, manipulation, secrecy, religious conflict, and an attachment that many people close to Travis had already started worrying about long before his death. Friends would later describe moments that seemed strange in hindsight. Controlling behavior, unexpected appearances, emotional volatility, small warning signs that, at the time, didn't fully make sense. Until they did. And what shocked the country wasn't just the crime itself. It was Jodi Arias. The interviews, the contradictions, the calmness, the shifting emotions, the way she could appear vulnerable one moment and strangely detached the next. The more the public watched her speak, the more one question seemed to grow. Who was the real Jodi Arias? Because beneath the headlines and courtroom footage was something much more unsettling than a simple murder case. This was a story about obsession slowly turning into destruction. If you enjoy detailed and professionally researched true crime documentaries, subscribe to Dark Crime Casefiles, where no crime stays in the dark. And in this documentary, we uncover the full story behind one of America's most infamous relationship murders, piece by piece, lie by lie. Long before the interrogations, the courtroom headlines, and the national attention, Jodi Arias was, to most people, entirely unremarkable. She wasn't someone who stood out in an obvious way. Friends and acquaintances often described her as quiet, polite, artistic, and socially adaptable. She could come across as thoughtful and easy to talk to, someone capable of blending comfortably into different environments depending on who she was around. And that ability, to adapt, to mirror, to become what people seemed to want her to be, would later become one of the most discussed aspects of her personality. Born in California in 1980, Jodi grew up in what outwardly appeared to be a relatively ordinary environment. There was no single dramatic event in her early life that clearly foreshadowed the case that would later consume national attention. But as people began looking back after the murder, certain patterns started to emerge, patterns involving emotional dependency, insecurity, and an intense need for connection and validation. By the time she entered adulthood, Jodi was still searching for stability in different areas of her life. Relationships seemed to carry unusual emotional weight for her. Attention mattered deeply. Acceptance mattered deeply. And when connections became emotionally significant, she appeared to invest in them intensely. People who knew her during different periods often described slightly different versions of her personality. Around some people, she appeared shy and reserved. Around others, more outgoing and confident. It was as though her identity could shift depending on the environment she was in and the person she wanted approval from. At first, that didn't seem dangerous. If anything, it made her appear flexible, adaptable, eager to connect. But underneath that adaptability was something less stable, a tendency to attach deeply and emotionally, especially in relationships that became central to her sense of self. And that instability rarely revealed itself immediately. It surfaced gradually, through emotional intensity, through possessiveness, through difficulty letting go. As years passed, Jodi moved through jobs, friendships, and relationships while still searching for something that seemed permanently out of reach: certainty, belonging, emotional security. And people close to her would later describe moments where rejection or emotional distance appeared to affect her more deeply than expected. Not always outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. That distinction would matter later. Because one of the reasons this case became so psychologically fascinating is that Jodi Arias did not fit the public's typical image of someone capable of violence. She wasn't loud. She wasn't visibly aggressive. She didn't initially present herself as dangerous. Instead, she often appeared emotionally vulnerable. And in many ways, that made her harder to fully understand. There was also another pattern beginning to emerge during this period of her life: identity attachment. When Jodi became emotionally invested in someone, she didn't just connect with the person. She often seemed to absorb aspects of their world, their interests, and even their beliefs. That tendency would become especially significant once she met the man who would eventually alter the course of her life completely. Because when Travis Alexander entered the picture, the connection between them developed quickly and intensely. To outsiders, it initially looked exciting, passionate, even promising. But beneath the chemistry was an emotional imbalance that neither of them fully understood yet. And over time, that imbalance would begin pulling the relationship towards something far darker than either of them may have imagined. When Jodi Arias first met Travis Alexander in 2006, the connection between them appeared immediate. They met at a business conference in Las Vegas, and from the beginning, there was a strong attraction between them. Travis was charismatic, confident, socially outgoing, and deeply involved in his faith as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. People around him often described him as ambitious and energetic, someone who could easily command attention in a room while also appearing warm and approachable. Jodi, on the other hand, seemed quieter by comparison, more reserved. But around Travis, something shifted. Their conversations quickly became personal, and before long, the relationship intensified emotionally and physically. To outsiders, they looked deeply connected. But almost from the beginning, there were contradictions built into the relationship itself. One of the biggest was religion. Travis took his faith seriously. He spoke openly about wanting a stable future, marriage, and a relationship aligned with his religious values. At the same time, however, his relationship with Jodi was emotionally and physically complicated. The connection between them didn't fit neatly into the image he wanted to maintain publicly, and over time, that tension created instability between them. Jodi eventually converted to Mormonism, something many interpreted as a sign of commitment to Travis and his world. But looking back, some people questioned whether the conversion reflected genuine spiritual change or a deeper emotional attachment to him specifically. Because by this point, Travis had become more than just a boyfriend in Jodi's life. He had become the emotional center of it. And the deeper that attachment grew, the harder it became for her to separate her identity from the relationship itself. At first, the intensity between them may have seemed passionate. They spent large amounts of time communicating, sharing personal conversations, private moments, and emotional highs that made the relationship feel consuming. But intensity and stability are not the same thing. And slowly, cracks began to form beneath the surface. Friends of Travis would later describe the relationship as unpredictable, sometimes affectionate and deeply connected, other times emotionally exhausting. There were arguments, periods of separation, reconciliation, tension, and confusion about where they truly stood with each other. Travis appeared conflicted. There were moments where he pulled Jodi closer, and moments where he tried creating distance. That inconsistency only deepened the imbalance. Because while Travis seemed uncertain about the long-term future of the relationship, Jodi appeared increasingly emotionally invested in preserving it at almost any cost. And over time, that difference became impossible to ignore. The relationship started operating in cycles. Connection, conflict, distance, reconnection, again and again. Even after periods where Travis attempted to move on, communication between them continued. Phone calls, messages, visits, it never seemed to fully end. And the more unstable the relationship became, the more emotionally charged it appeared to grow. There were also signs that the dynamic was beginning to affect Travis psychologically. Friends later recalled conversations where he expressed frustration, confusion, and concern about the emotional intensity surrounding the relationship. At times, he seemed drawn to Jodi. At other times, overwhelmed by her presence in his life. But despite those concerns, the connection between them remained difficult to sever completely. And that's part of what makes this case so unsettling in hindsight. Because unlike many crimes driven by sudden conflict between strangers, this story unfolded inside a relationship that had once felt deeply personal, intimate, and emotionally dependent. The danger didn't appear overnight. It developed slowly, through attachment, emotional imbalance, unresolved tension, and an inability to let go. And as Travis began trying more seriously to move forward with his life, something inside the relationship began shifting from emotional intensity into something far more unstable. Something that people close to them would only fully recognize after it was already too late. As the relationship between Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander became more unstable, the emotional imbalance between them started turning into something far more concerning. What had once appeared passionate now began carrying an undercurrent of tension that people around Travis could increasingly sense. By this point, the relationship was no longer clearly defined. They had broken up, reconnected, drifted apart again, and continued communicating in ways that kept emotional boundaries blurred. Travis seemed to be trying to move forward with his life, but Jodi remained deeply attached to him emotionally, and that attachment appeared to intensify every time distance entered the relationship. And slowly, the dynamic began shifting from connection into control. Friends later described moments that, in hindsight, felt alarming. Jodi would appear unexpectedly. She seemed unusually aware of Travis's schedule, his activities, and the women he spoke to. There were growing concerns about jealousy and emotional possessiveness, concerns that became harder to dismiss as isolated incidents. One of the most discussed aspects of this period involved allegations of stalking behavior. According to people close to Travis, there were incidents involving suspicious appearances, unexplained access to private information, and moments where Jodi seemed unable to fully detach from his life even after the relationship had officially ended. At one point, allegations surfaced involving slashed tires, incidents many believed were connected to escalating tension surrounding Travis's interactions with other women. While some details remained disputed publicly, the broader pattern was becoming increasingly difficult for those around him to ignore. The relationship no longer felt emotionally healthy. It felt consuming. And what made the situation even more complicated was that Travis himself appeared conflicted. Despite expressing frustration and concern to friends, communication between him and Jodi continued. There were still phone calls, still private conversations, still moments where emotional intimacy resurfaced even while he was trying to create separation. That inconsistency kept the emotional connection alive. But it also created instability. Because for someone already struggling with emotional attachment and fear of rejection, mixed signals can deepen obsession rather than weaken it. And over time, the emotional intensity surrounding Jodi Arias seemed to grow darker. There were moments where Travis reportedly confided to friends that he felt emotionally drained by the relationship. Some recalled him describing Jodi as manipulative or unpredictable. Others remembered conversations where he expressed discomfort about how difficult it had become to establish distance between them. Yet even then, few people imagined the situation could eventually escalate into violence. At least not violence on the level investigators would later uncover. But underneath the emotional chaos, warning signs were becoming more visible. Jodi's identity appeared increasingly tied to Travis. His approval mattered. His attention mattered. His presence in her life mattered. And every indication that he was moving on seemed to trigger stronger emotional reactions. Meanwhile, Travis was beginning to focus more seriously on his future. He was traveling frequently, socializing, meeting new people, and discussing long-term goals that no longer seemed centered around Jodi. Friends noticed he appeared interested in finding a relationship that aligned more closely with the stable future he envisioned for himself. And for Jodi, that growing emotional distance may have felt unbearable. Because obsession rarely begins with violence. It often begins with the inability to accept emotional loss. And by now, that inability was becoming increasingly apparent. There were arguments, emotional confrontations, tension that seemed to linger beneath almost every interaction between them. The relationship had become emotionally exhausting, unpredictable, and psychologically unhealthy for both sides. But perhaps the most unsettling part was how ordinary much of it still looked from the outside. People saw relationship drama, breakup complications, emotional messiness. What they didn't fully see was the escalation happening underneath. The growing resentment, the emotional fixation, the inability to let go. And as Travis Alexander continued trying to create distance between himself and Jodi Arias, the relationship was approaching a point where emotional instability and obsession would collide in a way that could no longer be reversed. By the spring of 2008, the relationship between Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander had become increasingly fractured. To people around Travis, it seemed clear that he was trying to move forward. He continued focusing on work, travel, friendships, and plans for the future. There were growing signs that he wanted emotional distance from Jodi, even if communication between them had never fully stopped. But despite the separation, Jodi remained connected to his life in ways that still felt unusually intense. And in the days leading up to Travis Alexander's death, a series of decisions made by Jodi Arias would later draw intense scrutiny from investigators. Because when authorities eventually reconstructed the timeline, they discovered movements and behaviors that appeared increasingly difficult to explain as coincidence. In early June 2008, Jodi was supposed to be traveling elsewhere entirely. Yet along the way, several unusual details emerged. She rented a car rather than using her own vehicle. Investigators would later examine reports involving missing license plates and fuel containers carried during the trip, details prosecutors would eventually argue suggested preparation and an effort to avoid detection. At the time, none of those actions seemed significant individually, but together, they painted a troubling picture. Meanwhile, Travis remained unaware of how close the situation was moving toward disaster. On June 4, 2008, Jodi arrived at Travis Alexander's home in Mesa, Arizona. What exactly happened inside that house over the following hours would later become one of the most debated and analyzed aspects of the entire case. Because unlike many crimes that leave behind uncertainty about who was present, this scene contained something deeply unusual: a camera. Investigators later recovered digital photographs taken inside the home that day, images showing Travis alive only hours before his death. Some appeared ordinary at first glance. Casual moments between two people who knew each other intimately. But buried among those files were images investigators believed unintentionally captured part of the timeline surrounding the murder itself. And suddenly, the case became far more disturbing, because the evidence suggested that whatever happened inside the home that day did not unfold in one sudden explosive moment. Instead, it appeared connected to a series of interactions unfolding over hours, moments where normalcy and violence existed terrifyingly close together. The exact emotional atmosphere inside the house can never be fully known, but investigators would later believe that tension between them had likely been building long before that day arrived. At some point, the situation escalated beyond recovery. What followed transformed the relationship permanently from emotional obsession into irreversible violence. The details of the crime scene shocked even experienced investigators. Not simply because of the violence itself, but because of what it appeared to reveal emotionally. The attack suggested intensity, rage, personal confrontation. This was not a detached crime committed by strangers. It felt deeply personal. And afterward, something even more unsettling happened. Jodi Arias did not immediately confess. She did not contact authorities. She did not tell friends what had happened inside that house. Instead, according to investigators, she left. And for days afterward, life outside the home continued moving normally. Friends attempted contacting Travis but received no response. At first, there was an immediate panic. Travis traveled frequently and maintained a busy schedule, so silence alone didn't immediately trigger alarm. But eventually, concern began to grow. Calls went unanswered. Messages piled up. Friends noticed unusual inactivity and started realizing something was wrong. Then came the moment that changed everything. On June 9th, friends entered Travis Alexander's home. Inside, they discovered his body. The shock spread quickly. Friends were devastated. Investigators were called immediately. And almost from the beginning, detectives understood they were dealing with a deeply complex and emotionally charged homicide investigation. But at that stage, one thing remained unclear. Where was Jodi Arias in all of this? Because while detectives began processing one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had encountered, the woman at the center of Travis Alexander's personal life was already beginning to shape a story that would continue changing again and again and again. In the hours after Travis Alexander was discovered inside his Mesa home, investigators were immediately confronted with a crime scene that raised disturbing questions. This was not a random burglary, not a break-in gone wrong. The violence felt personal. Detectives quickly began speaking with friends, gathering timelines, and trying to understand who had last been in contact with Travis before his death. And almost immediately, one name surfaced repeatedly: Jodi Arias. At first, that alone wasn't unusual. Jodi had been deeply involved in Travis's life for years. Friends knew the relationship had been complicated, emotional, and unstable at times. But as investigators looked closer, something about the situation began to stand out. Jodi's behavior. When news of Travis's death spread among people close to him, reactions were filled with shock, grief, and confusion. But according to investigators and witnesses, Jodi's responses sometimes felt strangely inconsistent. At moments, she appeared emotional. At others, oddly detached, as though she were trying to carefully manage how she was perceived. And then there were the inconsistencies in her timeline. When detectives first spoke to Jodi, she denied being involved entirely. She claimed she had not even been in Mesa at the time of the murder. According to her version of events, she had last seen Travis much earlier and knew nothing about what had happened inside the house. But investigators were already uncovering evidence that complicated that story. The most significant discovery came from the digital camera recovered at the scene. Initially, the device appeared damaged, placed in a washing machine in what investigators believed may have been an attempt to destroy evidence. But forensic technicians were able to recover deleted images from the memory card. And what they found changed the investigation completely. The recovered photographs placed Jodi Arias inside Travis Alexander's home on the day of the murder. Not days before. Not weeks earlier. That day. The images documented parts of their time together only hours before Travis's death. And suddenly, the timeline Jodi had given investigators collapsed almost instantly. Now detectives knew something critical. Jodi had lied. And once a suspect lies about being present at a homicide scene, every other statement begins to carry a different weight. When confronted with the evidence, Jodi's story shifted. Suddenly, she admitted being there, but introduced a completely different explanation. According to this new version, unknown masked intruders had entered the house and attacked Travis while threatening her life. It was a dramatic claim, but investigators struggled to find evidence supporting it. There were no signs of unidentified intruders forcing entry. No evidence pointing toward an outside attack. And as detectives continued analyzing the scene, the story itself began raising more questions than answers. Why had she initially denied being there at all? Why wait until evidence forced her to change the narrative? And why did each new explanation seem to appear only after investigators disproved the last one? The investigation was no longer simply about solving Travis Alexander's murder. It was becoming an effort to untangle Jodi Arias herself. Because detectives were beginning to sense they were dealing with someone highly adaptive, someone capable of reshaping her story depending on the pressure being applied. And the deeper they looked into her movements before and after the murder, the more suspicious everything became. Phone records, travel timelines, gas purchases, rental car details, inconsistencies in memory. Individually, some details may not have seemed overwhelming, but together, They formed a growing pattern of behavior investigators believed pointed toward preparation, deception, and an attempt to distance herself from the crime after it had already happened. Meanwhile, public fascination with the case was beginning to grow. Not just because of the violence, but because of Jodi Arias herself. People who watched early interviews and heard details of the investigation found themselves unsettled by the contrast between her demeanor and the allegations surrounding her. She could appear calm, vulnerable, cooperative, even sympathetic. But underneath that calmness, detectives believed something else was happening. Every conversation with Jodi seemed to produce a new version of reality. And with each contradiction, investigators moved closer to a realization that would define the rest of the case. This was no longer a mystery about whether Jodi Arias was connected to the murder. The real question was how far she was willing to go to avoid admitting the truth. By the time investigators formally brought Jodi Arias in for extended questioning, the case had already begun shifting dramatically. Detectives no longer viewed her as simply a former girlfriend connected to the victim. They viewed her as someone actively trying to manipulate the investigation. And what followed inside those interrogation rooms would become one of the most analyzed and discussed sequences in modern true crime history. Because unlike suspects who appear visibly panicked or aggressive under pressure, Jodi Arias presented herself very differently. She remained calm, soft-spoken, polite. At times, she even seemed oddly relaxed. And that calmness created a deeply unsettling contrast with the reality investigators were trying to uncover. From the beginning, detectives noticed something unusual about the way she answered questions. Jodi rarely responded impulsively. Instead, she appeared to calculate her words carefully, often pausing before speaking, adjusting details, or subtly redirecting conversations when pressure increased. It felt less like someone recalling traumatic events, and more like someone constructing a narrative in real time. And investigators were paying attention to every inconsistency. At first, Jodi maintained that she had nothing to do with Travis Alexander's death. She insisted she had not even been at the house. But once detectives confronted her with the recovered camera photographs proving otherwise, the entire story shifted. Suddenly, masked intruders became responsible. According to Jodi's new version, 2 unknown attackers had entered the home, murdered Travis Alexander, and threatened her life if she ever spoke about what happened. It was dramatic, detailed in certain places, vague in others. But detectives immediately noticed problems. The story lacked supporting evidence. Important details seemed inconsistent. And perhaps most importantly, the explanation only appeared after investigators proved she had lied about being there at all. That pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every time evidence closed one door, Jodi opened another story. And as questioning continued, detectives slowly increased the psychological pressure. What made these interrogations so compelling wasn't shouting or intimidation. In many ways, the opposite was true. Investigators often remained controlled and patient, allowing Jodi room to speak, elaborate, and continue building narratives that increasingly contradicted physical evidence. The more she talked, the more complicated the situation became. At times, Jodi appeared emotional, crying softly, speaking about fear, vulnerability, and trauma. Moments later, however, her demeanor could shift unexpectedly. There were instances where she smiled, laughed nervously, or spoke casually about details surrounding the investigation in ways that many viewers later found deeply unsettling. That unpredictability became one of the defining psychological elements of the case. Because people watching the interrogation footage struggled to understand who Jodi Arias really was. Was she manipulative? Terrified? Calculated? Emotionally unstable? The answers seemed to change depending on the moment. And perhaps that's what made the footage so addictive to the public. The interrogations felt less like a straightforward confession process and more like a psychological chess match unfolding in real time. Investigators would present evidence carefully, phone records, timelines, photographs, inconsistencies, and watch how Jodi adapted. Sometimes she denied details outright. Other times she partially acknowledged facts while reshaping the context around them. But slowly the pressure tightened. because the physical evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to explain away. And eventually, another version of the story emerged. This time, Jodi admitted she had killed Travis Alexander. But even then, the narrative changed again. Now, she claimed it had been self-defense. According to her account, the situation inside the house escalated violently after Travis allegedly became aggressive toward her. She portrayed herself as someone forced into survival rather than someone carrying out a deliberate act. But investigators remained skeptical. Not only because this was now the third major version of events, but also because many elements still failed to align with the evidence gathered from the scene. And by this point, detectives had begun understanding something critical about Jodi Arias. The truth, when it came to her, never arrived cleanly. It arrived in fragments, adjustments, revisions. Every story seemed designed not necessarily to reveal what happened, but to protect her from the consequences of what investigators were uncovering. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation room, public fascination with the case exploded. People became obsessed with the footage. Millions watched clips of Jodi speaking with detectives, analyzing her body language, her expressions, and her emotional shifts. Some believed she was cold and manipulative. Others saw someone psychologically unraveling under pressure. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. There was something deeply unsettling about the contrast between her calm demeanor and the brutality of the crime investigators believed she had committed. And as the interrogations continued, one reality became increasingly unavoidable. The carefully shifting narratives were beginning to collapse under the weight of evidence. The woman who once denied even being present at the scene was now admitting she had killed Travis Alexander. The only thing left to determine was whether anyone would believe the reasons she gave for doing it. By the time Jodi Arias entered the courtroom, the case had already grown far beyond a standard homicide investigation. It had become a national obsession. News networks covered it constantly. Courtroom footage spread across television and the internet. Clips from interrogations circulated everywhere. And as more people watched Jodi Arias speak, testify, and respond under pressure, public fascination only intensified. Because this case wasn't just about the murder of Travis Alexander anymore. It had evolved into something larger, a public attempt to understand who Jodi Arias really was beneath the constantly changing narratives. And inside the courtroom, that question became the center of everything. The prosecution argued that Travis Alexander's death was not the result of panic or self-defense. According to investigators and prosecutors, the evidence pointed toward premeditation, emotional obsession, and a deliberate attempt to avoid accountability afterward. Meanwhile, the defense presented a very different picture. Jodi Arias testified extensively during the trial, portraying herself as someone trapped in a toxic and emotionally damaging relationship. She described Travis as controlling and aggressive behind closed doors and argued that the violence that day occurred in the context of fear and survival. But the problem for many watching the trial was consistency. Because by this stage, the public had already seen multiple versions of Jodi's story. First, she claimed she wasn't there. Then, masked intruders. Then, self-defense. And every contradiction weakened trust further. That tension turned the courtroom into something unusually intense. It wasn't simply about evidence anymore. It was about credibility, personality, perception. Every expression Jodi made was analyzed. Every answer dissected. Every emotional reaction debated online and across television panels. The trial became deeply psychological. People weren't just watching for facts. They were trying to determine whether they believed her. And as Jodi spent days on the witness stand, the public's fascination only grew stronger. There were moments where she appeared composed and articulate, carefully explaining details of the relationship and presenting herself as emotionally wounded. Other moments, however, created visible discomfort among viewers, instances where her reactions seemed emotionally detached, overly controlled, or unexpectedly calm given the severity of the case. The contrast was difficult to ignore, and prosecutors focused heavily on that contrast. They methodically highlighted inconsistencies between Jodi's testimony and the evidence gathered during the investigation. Timelines were challenged. Statements were revisited. Prior interviews were examined closely, and piece by piece, prosecutors attempted to demonstrate that her evolving stories reflected deception rather than confusion or trauma. Meanwhile, media coverage amplified every major moment. Television audiences became captivated by the trial's emotional intensity, relationship dynamics, and psychological complexity. Commentators debated whether Jodi Arias was manipulative, narcissistic, emotionally unstable, or genuinely traumatized. Public opinion became sharply divided in certain areas, but one thing remained consistent. People could not stop watching. Part of that fascination came from how unusual Jodi Arias appeared compared to the public's expectations of someone accused of such violence. She didn't fit neatly into a single image. At times, she seemed vulnerable and emotional. At others, strategic and calculating. That unpredictability became central to the media storm surrounding the case. And while the defense continued emphasizing self-defense and emotional trauma, prosecutors kept returning to the same underlying argument. The evidence showed preparation. The lies showed consciousness of guilt. And the changing stories showed someone trying to escape responsibility. As the trial moved closer to its conclusion, the image Jodi Arias had attempted to maintain for years was beginning to fracture publicly. The calmness that once appeared controlled now felt suspicious to many viewers. The emotional performances became harder for some to separate from manipulation. And the contradictions that had surfaced during the investigation followed her directly into the courtroom. By the end of the proceedings, the trial had transformed into one of the most publicly dissected true crime cases in America. Not simply because of what happened to Travis Alexander, but because millions of people became captivated by the woman accused of killing him, and the unsettling realization that even after months of testimony, many still felt they didn't fully understand who Jodi Arias really was. As the trial finally neared its end, the attention surrounding Jodi Arias showed no signs of slowing down. By that point, the case had already become one of the most heavily analyzed true crime stories in modern America, not only because of the murder itself, but because of the psychological questions that seemed to linger around every part of it. People weren't just debating evidence anymore. They were debating personality, manipulation, obsession, control. And at the center of all of it remained the same unsettling question that had followed the case from the beginning. Who was Jodi Arias, really? For prosecutors, the answer was clear. They argued that the killing of Travis Alexander reflected emotional obsession escalating into deliberate violence. The changing stories, the attempts to distance herself from the scene, and the contradictions throughout the investigation were presented as signs of calculated deception rather than confusion or trauma. The defense, however, continued emphasizing emotional instability, fear, and the toxic nature of the relationship itself, arguing that the events inside the house unfolded within a psychologically volatile dynamic that had deteriorated over time. But regardless of which interpretation people believed, one reality had become impossible to ignore. The relationship between Jodi and Travis had become profoundly unhealthy long before violence entered the picture. And that realization is part of why the case affected so many people emotionally. Because unlike crimes involving strangers, this story unfolded inside emotional intimacy. It developed slowly through attachment, insecurity, dependency, jealousy, rejection, and unresolved emotional conflict. The danger wasn't obvious in the beginning. It emerged gradually. And psychologically, that's what made the case so haunting. Over time, experts, commentators, and viewers began examining Jodi Arias through different lenses. Some discussions focused on narcissistic traits, emotional manipulation, and identity instability. Others pointed toward obsession, abandonment sensitivity, and the need for emotional control within relationships. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how adaptable she appeared to be. Throughout the investigation and trial, Jodi consistently shifted her presentation depending on the situation around her. At times she appeared vulnerable. At others, detached, cooperative, defensive, emotional. It often felt as though there was no stable version of her for people to fully hold on to. And that uncertainty became deeply unsettling for the public. Because people naturally search for clarity in cases like this. They want obvious warning signs. A clear explanation. A visible line separating normal behavior from dangerous behavior. But the Jodi Arias case blurred those lines constantly. That's part of why the footage, testimony, and interrogations remained so endlessly discussed online. Even years later, viewers continue analyzing her behavior, expressions, and statements, searching for something definitive hidden beneath the contradictions. Eventually, after years of legal proceedings and sentencing phases, the outcome became final. Jodi Arias was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Legally, the case had reached its conclusion. But emotionally and psychologically, it never fully disappeared from public consciousness. Because this story left behind more than headlines. It left behind a warning about emotional obsession left unchecked. About relationships that slowly become psychologically destructive beneath the surface. About how manipulation and attachment can escalate quietly over time while appearing almost ordinary to the outside world. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it forced people to confront how difficult it can be to truly understand someone, even after watching them speak for hundreds of hours. Because by the end of the case, millions of people had seen Jodi Arias cry, smile, explain herself, defend herself, and tell her story repeatedly. And yet for many, the same feeling remained. They still didn't know who she really was. Maybe that's why this case continues haunting people years later. Not simply because of the violence, but because of the psychological ambiguity surrounding the person accused of committing it. A relationship that began with attraction and emotional connection had eventually collapsed into obsession, manipulation, and irreversible destruction. And once that line was crossed, nothing, not the interviews, the courtroom testimony, or the endless explanations afterward, could ever undo what happened inside that house in Mesa, Arizona. In the years since the death of Travis Alexander, the case has remained one of the most talked about true crime stories in America, not only because of the violence involved but also because of the psychological questions it left behind. For many people, the most haunting part of this story isn't a single courtroom moment or interrogation clip. It's the realization that toxic relationships rarely become destructive overnight. Sometimes they deteriorate slowly beneath the surface, hidden inside emotional dependency, jealousy, manipulation, insecurity, and the inability to let go. And by the time the warning signs become impossible to ignore, the damage has already been done. Friends and family remembered Travis as ambitious, social, driven, and deeply connected to the people around him. Long before the headlines and media attention, he was a real person with goals, relationships, friendships, and a future he was actively building. That's important to remember, because cases like this can easily become consumed by the psychology of the accused while the victim slowly fades into the background. But at the center of all of this was a life that was permanently taken away. And as the years passed, the story of Jodi Arias became more than just a courtroom case. It became a disturbing example of how emotional instability and obsession can evolve into something devastating when attachment turns into control. What makes the case so unsettling even now is how difficult the warning signs were to fully recognize in real time. Nothing about the relationship initially looked like it was heading toward tragedy. There were no flashing alarms in the beginning. No clear indication of the destruction waiting underneath years of emotional tension and instability. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable truth behind this entire story. Danger does not always appear obvious. Sometimes it hides inside charm, inside attachment, inside emotional dependency, inside relationships that seem complicated but survivable, until suddenly they aren't. The Jodi Arias case remains one of the clearest examples of how obsession, manipulation, and hidden instability can quietly grow beneath the surface of a relationship long before the outside world realizes how serious the situation has become. And even after all the interviews, investigations, testimony, and media coverage, the story still leaves people with the same uneasy feeling. How well do we truly know the people closest to us? If you want more real, detailed crime stories like this, subscribe to Dark Crime Casefiles, where no crime stays in the dark. And if this case left an impression on you, let me know your thoughts below. Was this a case of manipulation, obsession, self-defense, or something even more psychologically complex. Until next time, stay aware, because some of the darkest stories hide behind the most ordinary appearances.